me, but my name is Anna Schultz, and I am a TRC grad scholar as well as a very recent graduate, as of 2 days ago, of the Public Administration Master's Program. And my research has been mostly looking at how to adapt bridges to the effects of climate change, including heavier precipitation, more floods, more extreme freeze-thaw cycles, among other things. And being an MPA student, a lot of that has focused on kind of the policy mechanisms around that rather than the engineering side, which I will leave to my other TRC friends. So part of this has involved looking through state funding documents for states in northern New England, mostly Vermont and Maine. I delved some into New Hampshire, but didn't get very far because New Hampshire is bonkers crazy and does everything on a 10-year time scale, which makes it kind of hard. So my first project was going through statewide transportation improvement programs, finding all of the projects over the last 15 years that related to bridges and uploading them into a database, which we then used to calibrate an agent-based model that we could use to run through different scenarios. So we could look at how we could predict changes based on funding fluxes, changes in regional priority, that sort of thing. And we also spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how states and MPOs prioritize projects. Because there are so many potential projects and so little funding, it's difficult for states and MPOs to pick which projects are the most important. And we found out Vermont has a really pretty quantifiable, specific system, or at least they do as of the last few years, for how they pick which projects to do. Whereas Maine, they kind of rank projects and they have this report card and all projects get graded, but at the end of the day, it's just a group of people sitting down and picking which projects seem to be most important. So that kind of reveals a little bit about how the governance structures in either state contribute to transportation infrastructure projects. And another thing we determined is that most of the time, if projects score really well on environmental sustainability, they're actually a lot less likely to make it into the statewide project to-do list than if they score really well on system preservation, which points to the fact that we're just continuing to try to maintain our system rather than moving to a system that seems long-term sustainable, at least for the environment. On my lovely poster here, which you can maybe see, or maybe not, I run through the prioritization procedures for either state, and I also spent some time looking into the current practice in each state and found that one of the biggest steps forward for strengthening bridges and adapting them is that people really care about fish, and natural resource councils in a lot of states have worked with DOTs to implement legislation so that bridges are bigger and don't restrict water flow, so that fish can keep migrating and spawning upstream. But it turns out that's actually really good when we're thinking about climate change, because bigger bridges are also a lot less likely to be washed out, which is kind of an interesting side effect. And looking into funding, we learned that comparatively between the two states of Vermont and Maine, Vermont has been investing steadily more and more into its bridges, whereas Maine is really spastic and hasn't had a steady trend. And there needs to be more research done on this, and I won't be here to do it, but somebody can. But I mean, we suspect that part of that has to do with the fact that Vermont was totally devastated by Irene and saw firsthand how disastrous it can be to not deal with adapting bridges now. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve and make them better able to deal with climate change, whereas Maine hasn't had that kind of policy focusing event to spur them into action. And political processes contribute a lot too. Our political leadership in the State House has made a big difference compared to Maine's, just in terms of priorities. So there are a lot of things that matter. There's a lot to be done, and hopefully the TRC can contribute some good research to help states figure out where to go next.
So my name is Paula Recalde, and I'll be talking about my research very briefly, which is about teenagers' mode choice to and from school and technology use for transportation. And I'll be analyzing students from 5 different high schools in the country. 3 of them are in California and 2 of them are in Vermont. So my research questions look at 2 different main topics. One would be looking at the factors that influence travel mode choice to and from school of teenagers. I'm going to look at the socio-demographic and built environment factors that are relevant for students for both states. And then I'm going to look at attitudinal factors influencing students in California and the behavior of parents and guardians and other social factors influencing students in Vermont. And the other research question would be looking at the factors that influence the use of technology for transportation purposes among students in both California and Vermont, but I'm also going to look at both socio-demographic and built environment characteristics in both states, and then the attitudinal factors in influencing teenagers in California, and then how do the texting and communication behavior of the Vermont teenagers relate to their use of technology for arranging transportation. So in order for me to answer these questions, the data that I'll be using is survey data and spatial analysis data. So the survey data that I'm using, I got it from 2 previous projects that were developed in UC Davis, California, and here in Vermont. So the high schools that were surveyed were Davis High School, Sequoia High School, and Tamalpais High School in California, and then South Burlington High School and Champlain Valley Union High School here in Vermont. The data that I will be able to get from the survey questions are the age and gender of the teenagers, what mode they choose to go to and from school, if they do have a driving license or not, if they have access to a car, how many siblings do they have, their parents' education, the attitudes towards transportation. Those were questions that were asked in the California survey. If they use technology for transportation purposes, and how often do they do that every week. And then looking at the built environment characteristics, I would look at the population density around the households where teenagers live, as well as the teenager density around that area, the total length of the street within specific service areas around the households, most common job types around the area, and also the most common mode choice to commute to work in the area. So for my first question, looking at the mode choice to and from school of teenagers, all the variables that I'll be using are categorical variables, and if they're not, I just created some kind of categorical variable. So such as gender, age, parents' education, the distance from the household to the high school, and my outcome would be the mode choice to and from school, so I'll be running a multinomial logistic regression to answer this question. And for my second question, looking at the technology used for transportation purposes among teenagers, I will also be using categorical data to answer the question, but my outcome would be ordinal at this time, so I'll be running an ordinal logistic regression for this question. So here included, I know there's a lot of numbers, but I'll go through it very quick. I included the outcome of my first model looking at the mode to school of teenagers. So I divided the mode outcome in bike, walk, taking the bus, riding with someone, or driving. So here we can see that comparing biking or walking versus driving, males do bike or walk more than drive. Having a bike increases the biking or walking among teenagers versus driving. Having a license increases driving versus walking or driving. The fact that teenagers do not use technology or use it less frequently increases biking or walking versus driving. Having a smartphone decreases biking and increases driving. Having younger population within 5-mile buffer around the household also increases biking and walking. And having a better street connectivity within 5 mile increases biking or walking. This is only comparing biking or walking versus driving. And here would be comparing taking the bus versus driving. So we see that many less variables are significant in this model. Only parents' education, having a driving license, and the frequency of technology use would have a significant effect on the mode choice of teenagers. So the higher the education, the more likely it is to drive for a teenager. Having a driving license, of course, has a very significant effect on driving among teenagers, and a lower use of technology for transportation would increase taking the bus among teenagers. And lastly, looking at the comparison between riding with someone versus driving themselves, only the fact that the teenager would have a driving license would be significant when deciding between riding or driving. And regarding my second question, looking at the technology used for transportation, many less variables were significant in this case, but we can see that the higher education of parents would increase the use of technology for transportation purposes among teenagers. Having a smartphone would increase the use of technology as well. Having a higher proportion of management positions in the area where the teenager lives also has increase in the use of technology for transportation, and having a license also has an increase of in the use of technology for transportation. So based on the outcomes that I just showed you, we can see that the built environment variables influence more teenagers' active transportation, such as biking or walking, when we are analyzing their mode to school. When we look at the technology question, the variables that are more linked to this question would be the ones that are more related to parents' education or income-related factors, rather than the built environment. I must say that the models that I'm running are explanatory models, they're not predicted. So I think I put it in previous slides, but the R-square for this model, it's pretty decent, it's like 0.407, but for the technology case, it's very, very low. So we can say that the data that we have is not enough to answer or to understand why increases or decreases the use of technology among teenagers with the data that we have. But we can say that the income-related variables certainly make it significant effect in the use of technology among teenagers. So I would like to compare because this is all California and Vermont data collapsed, but I would like to compare both Vermont and California to see if there were any significant differences. And then I still need to look at the attitudes for the California survey as well as the effect of the behavior of parents in the Vermont case.
Questions?
What kind of
So, is there some kind of like policy recommendation that you could see coming out of this kind of work, or like
Right.
like I imagine we want kids to actively travel more, like bike and walk. So
Yeah, so I guess that it would depend on who you want to, I mean, if, because we're analyzing Vermont and California and they're very different environments, it could be generalized more, the overall behavior of teenagers. So if someone were interested in promoting more active transportation, we could say, well, or if they were maybe worried about the income gap between people, how would that affect the teenagers in a certain area? So with this, we can mainly identify which are the variables that would make a teenager behave one way or the other way. So, yeah. John?
I was just going to ask, what, generally speaking, were the attitude variables that you have for California?
Right. So it will be like, I feel comfortable biking, or I do it because my friends do it, or my parents. Well, the survey that was conducted in California was very focused on biking, so that's why they had more questions regarding biking. But yeah, maybe my parents bike, so that makes me think that maybe biking is cool or maybe not cool. So yeah, that kind of questions.
Do you know the method that was used for survey students? And was it, did they capture the entire school or sample? Or?
So it was, the students were approaching a different way in both cases, but because the Vermont survey was an online survey, so whoever student that was willing to participate just participated. I think the professors just let them know about it, and they just participated. And then they were all voluntary, so I think in California they contacted the whole school, well, the whole high schools, and then the professors would hand out the survey, and the students could just answer it if they wanted to answer it or not.
Great, thanks so much.
Hello everyone, today I'm very happy to share the great working experience with Transportation Research Center at the University of Vermont. My name is Xiao. I'm a second year PhD student at Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resource. So a little brief introduction of my education background. I did my undergraduate degree of tourism management in Nanjing University. And I also did the master's degree of human geography in Nanjing University. I started my PhD program of natural resource in 2013, and I was very lucky to found it as a TRC scholar and worked both at Park Studies Lab and the Transportation Research Center at the University of Vermont. So my research interests includes three main areas. The transportation management in parks and protected areas, and the diversity issue related to parks and outdoor recreation, and protection of natural resource and cultural landscapes in recreation areas. So the Transportation Research Center has supported us to conduct a series of many interesting research projects. For example, this is a research project about transportation recreation opportunity spectrum, which is a framework that consists of the various indicators to help planning and managing transportation in context of parks and public lands. So I did the field investigation of monitoring visitor use in the national park roadways in Grand Canyon National Park in 2014. And this is another important research project that I'm working on, is about transportation as a barrier to visiting national park by minority racial ethnic groups. And the goal of this study is examining whether transportation is a barrier for some racial ethnic groups to access the parks, and how transportation can help to encourage the racial ethnic minorities to visit the parks more often. And the project will also examine the difference of transportation preference by racial ethnic groups, and how the National Park Service can diversify the transportation recreation opportunities for racial ethnic groups. And for this project, we conducted both the general population survey and on-site visitor survey at different national park areas. And this research project is another graduate student research grant that I applied successfully in Rubenstein School. And the goal of this study is evaluate the quality of transportation recreation facilities in parks and on public land. And the study is measure the quantitative measurement of the level of service and indicators and standards of visitors' experience of transportation recreation facilities in parks and public lands. And the study location was in Burlington Bypass, Vermont. So the Transportation Research Center also supports the student to attend many conferences, and during last 2 years, I've attended more than 6 conferences, including the Northeastern Recreation Research Symposium, the annual meeting of Transportation Research Board, and the annual meeting of Association of American Geographers. And those conference presentations help us to share our research result and build the network, build our career network with different researchers and agencies. And in the future, I will continuously to work as a TRC scholar for 2015 to 2016 and work on my dissertation about the role of transportation in expanding the democratic ideal of national parks. And I'm very looking forward to work with the TRC for other interesting research projects. Thanks.
Hey, my name is Sagar Sadehpour, and I've been working in 2 different projects during this last year. My slide is more than 5, but I'm gonna go to it so fast. So the first section is about network disaggregation and resiliency metrics, and the second part is about measuring the day-to-day variability in rural travel behavior. In first part, I have 2 main research questions. The first question is what level of network detail is needed to accurately access the criticality of the link in a transportation network? Do we need to include all the link in the network, or is a main road enough to measure the criticality of the link? And in the second main question is what level of OD metric is needed to measure the criticality of the link in transportation network. So how do we measure the criticality of the link? We use NRI, which is Network Robustness Index tools to measure the link criticality, and this is the method that disrupt each link, disrupt the capacity of each link, and measure the differences with the case when all the links are included in the network. And based on this NRI value, we make the rank order for the link in the network. For different network, I use 2 hypothetical network and 1 real network to get my research questions answers. The first network I used has 3 different representations with 96 link when all the which one is that?
I was holding it the wrong way. Like, first forward, that was my problem.
So what are you trying to?
I'm trying to see
Pointer.
The pointer.
the pointer. Okay, yeah.
The line.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. When I have all the links in the network, it has 93. It has 148 links in the network, and I'm removing the minor link, which are these links, to make the. I'm just keeping the main road in the network. By doing that, I got this result when the level of OD disaggregation level is constant, and the network is changing from just main road to include all the minor road in the model. So you see that this critical rank order not changing that much, but when we keep the network constant and change the level of OD metrics, we have more significant changes in rank order of the link. So I did the same thing for another hypothetical network, but here I get different results when the OD constant and where the when the network is constant. So we concluded that maybe the structure of the network is also important to studying the network resiliency. So we did the same thing for the real network, which is Chittenden County, Vermont network, and we got this result, which is when the network is constant and when the OD aggregation level is constant. And as you see, in both cases, we have changes, but it's not significant. Maybe, and again, we concluded that the structure of the network is important in this study. The second part of my, the second section of my study is the day-to-day variability in travel behavior and how we can measure this variability in travel behavior. The travel behavior has two different measure part, and I'm trying to measure the intrapersonal variability, which is the variability for one person during the different days, and for that we need multiple survey travel data, which we have it for this study, and this is the study area, which is Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and we have 4 days survey data. And during the different season, for answering my research question, I'm using a different socio-demographic variable, and I'm also using geospatial variable, which capture for example, the density of the residents in the area or the structure of the network in the study area. And my outcome variable to capture the variability is the mean of the travel time for each individual during different days, and also the standard deviation of the trip for each individual during different days, and also the number of trips each person made during these different days. So I'm gonna use this predictor variable and outcome variable to get my research question, and first of all I need to check all the data to see if there is any correlation between them and decide that which one of them are included in my model. So for my model I'm going to use binary logistic regression and multiple linear regression. So I think that's it. So I need to keep working on this project and finish it up.
Could you tell us what the what the relationship between your two research questions is? You have two.
Right.
What I see is distinctive, and there's connect. And what is the connectivity in terms of what you're trying to address?
I'm trying to say we can, for getting the OD metrics, demand metrics, we need this travel survey, and we need to study travel behavior to get an accurate OD metrics and use it in travel modeling. Yeah, and there is no that much connection, but it's the only connection we found different these two research.
My primary research that I've been involved in this year looks at the impact of information access on intercity travel by automobile, passenger rail, or bus. There's been a lot of existing research that looks at travel between large metropolitan areas, and this work looks at work that is originating from areas outside of Boston Metro within northern New England, so not originating from large metropolitan areas, but going to 4 large metro areas in the Northeast: Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. The data that we used came from a survey questionnaire that was administered in May of 2014 by a local firm, RSG. And the survey had 2,560 participants. And here you can see the breakdown of zip codes of where they're originating from. The largest numbers were coming from Massachusetts, followed by New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. The survey had about 100 questions. It asked things like recent travel trips to these metropolitan areas. It asked about travel preferences, some demographic information, and it asked about an imaginary trip going from the respondent's home to New York City. About halfway through the questionnaire, the survey sample was split into 2 groups. One group had access to an online travel planning tool that was developed with this survey by RSG, and that tool provided scheduling information from respondents' home location to New York City. The other group was a control group, and they did not have access to this planning tool. After that split was made, there were a series of questions and statements provided about an imaginary trip that for some reason the respondent had already agreed to take from their home to New York City in the next month. There was somebody else that was going to be covering lodging and such, but the actual travel expenses and details were up to the survey respondent. So we looked at differences overall between in responses between the control group and the test group. And then we also broke the sample into groups by age and by education to see what differences we could identify among those different groups. So here we see the breakdown between the control group and the test group for both age groups and education. We see some low numbers in the age groups of 18 to 24 and 75 and above. So we did not include those groups when we broke down the analysis. Over on the education side, we see a very low number of respondents that did not have a high school diploma. So we lumped them in with those that did have a high school or equivalent and included them as one group. We can see some differences here between the control and test groups, between ages of 45 and 54 and 65 and 74, as well as some of the education levels. So here we see a table that highlights the statements that were identified to have differences in responses between the control and test groups overall. We also looked at them, as mentioned, according to age and education level. So when we look at this first statement here, I am concerned that the schedule of the bus or train only lets me travel a few times per day, and I need to be flexible. Well, we did find a difference overall between the control and test group, so that the control group agreed more with the statement. We also saw a difference for age categories, for all age categories except for ages 65 to 75, and for any post-secondary degree. For the second statement, it would be easy for me to get the schedules for a bus or a train between here and New York City, and I would understand them. Here we saw that the control group, without access to the tool, agreed with the statement more overall, as well, but only for ages 25 to 44 with a bachelor's, graduate, or professional degree. And the third statement here, I think that taking a bus to New York City would take a lot longer than driving. We see here that the control group agreed with this more overall, but only for ages 25 to 44 with a bachelor's degree. Now, prior to asking questions about the imaginary trip to New York City, the first thing that we asked is, what is your likelihood of choosing a bus or a train for a trip to New York City? We asked them the same question after the split had been made and after they had answered all the other questions about this imaginary trip. What we found was that 43% of respondents changed their likelihood of choosing a bus or a train for from their house to New York City, and that more people who had access to the tool were becoming more likely to choose a bus or a train for a trip to New York City, while those people that did not have access to the tool were becoming less likely to choose a bus or a train to New York City. We also asked anybody that we identified a change in their response for any comments about that change. We gave them an open field, and so this just represents some of the highlights of those responses, where the words that are jumping out are those more common words. So overall, we found that for traveling to New York City by bus or a train, the planning tool was related to positive attitudes about scheduling flexibility and travel time. On the other hand, we found that the tool was related to negative attitudes about being able to get a hold of this scheduling information and to be able to understand it. This work is also going on to contribute to a related but separate study where we are measuring accessibility by multiple modes for traveling to New York City and these other 3 large metropolitan areas within our study region. Thanks.
Sounds like RSG needs to develop a better tool. Or someone does.
Well, it looks like there's a good opportunity for some of this more development for this type of information.